It is 4 in the morning on a Friday in June, and Samuel Beiler is standing in his root cellar with nothing but a kerosene lantern and a problem that most modern people do not even know they have. His family stored 40 pounds of dried beef in glass jars 3 weeks ago. Good beef, smoked and salted and wrapped in cloth the old way. Yesterday, he opened one jar to slice some for breakfast and found it crawling. Not with mold, not with bacteria, with fly larvae. Maggots the size of rice grains, writhing through meat that should have been safe for 8 more months. He stands there in the half-light, holding the jar at arm's length, and he knows exactly what happened. One fly. That is all it took. One female fly that slipped past the cheesecloth covering, laid her eggs in the crevice where the cloth met the jar rim, and disappeared. Within 5 days, those eggs hatched. Within 10 days, he had a problem he could not fix. Now, here is what most people get wrong about flies and food preservation. They think the fly is the problem. They think the solution is to kill the fly. They buy screens, they install traps, they wage chemical warfare against insects, and they lose anyway, because they are fighting the wrong battle. The Amish farmers I have studied do not fight the fly. They make the fly irrelevant. Before I show you the technique that keeps flies out of preserved meat for 9 months straight, without any poison, without any electricity, without any trap that needs to be checked and reset, we need to talk about what flies actually want. Because once you understand what a fly needs, you stop chasing flies away with herbs, and you start building spaces where flies literally cannot succeed. The fly is a creature of opportunity. It is not intelligent. It does not plan. It does not remember where your kitchen is or harbor a grudge against your pantry. The fly does 3 things, and 3 things only. It finds food. It lands on the food. It lays eggs. If you block any one of those 3 steps, the fly starves or it leaves. And here is the part that changes everything. The Amish and Plain community farmers have known for 200 years that the cheapest and most reliable barrier between a fly and your stored food is not a chemical. It is not even a trap. It is a specific combination of 2 things that work together in a way that most preppers and homesteaders completely overlook. The first is ancient. The second is simple physics. Together, they create what I call a fly-proof environment. And the beautiful part is this: once you set it up, it requires 0 maintenance. Let me walk you through exactly what happens when a fly encounters your dried meat storage the way Samuel's family does it, because the visual picture alone changes how you think about preservation forever. A fly enters the room. The first barrier is the most obvious one that everyone overlooks, which is airflow and the total absence of direct light. In Samuel's root cellar, there are no windows. There is one wooden door. The temperature stays between 38 and 45 degrees year-round without any refrigeration or electricity. Before electric lights existed, before screens were manufactured, before anyone had access to store-bought poison, this was the baseline environment. Flies are not attracted to cold, dark spaces with moving air. They are attracted to warmth, light, and stagnant air where they can smell decay and fermentation. So the second the fly enters that cooler, darker space, its nervous system registers that something is wrong. This is not a feeding environment. This is not a breeding environment. A fly at 50 degrees moves 5 times slower than a fly at 70 degrees. It cannot reproduce. Its egg-laying instinct literally shuts down. But the Amish know that is not enough, because one determined fly could still lay eggs if it found the right warm corner or a spot where light came through a crack. So they layer the second barrier on top of this environment. This is where it gets interesting. The dried herbs are not a repellent in the way most people think. The internet teaches that dried herbs drive flies away by smell alone. That is backwards. The herbs do something much more precise. When you hang specific dried herbs in bundles from the ceiling of a root cellar, you are changing the air itself. You are not chasing flies away. You are removing the chemical signals that tell a fly this space is worth exploring in the first place. Here is the science. Flies detect food sources through volatile organic compounds in the air. These compounds are the smell of decay, fermentation, protein breakdown, the scent of meat aging. When you introduce dried sage, dried bay leaf, and dried thyme into that airspace, you are not making the space smell bad to the fly. You are covering up the chemical profile that says, food is available here. A fly lands on the jar anyway, let us say. What happens next? The third barrier is the one that seals it completely. This is where the Amish use a technique so old and so effective that it predates screens by 300 years. They wrap the jar with cloth that has been soaked in a specific preparation. The cloth is not just a barrier, it is treated. In the 1700s, before commercial screening was available, before anyone had electricity to run cooling systems, Amish families preserved meat and dairy through seasons that would rot everything in a modern, unrefrigerated kitchen within days. They did it with three things layered together: the cold storage environment, the herb-treated air, and the cloth barrier that prevented eggs from reaching the surface of the food. The cloth they used was not random. It was always linen or tight-weave cotton, never loose muslin. Why? Because a fly egg is 4/1000ths of an inch long. A fly can squeeze through weaves wider than that. Tight linen has a weave diameter of less than 1/1000th of an inch. The fly physically cannot lay an egg in a place where it cannot reach the surface. You can sand the cloth to tighten it even further, which some families did. You can also treat the cloth with a preparation that I will show you in a moment. But here is what most survival content gets wrong about this entire process. People make it sound like the herbs do all the work. They sell the fantasy that you can just hang some dried rosemary in your pantry and flies will vanish. What they are not telling you is that rosemary alone, in a warm, bright, ventilated kitchen where air conditioning is running, will do almost nothing. The herb is only one piece. It is the combination that works, and the combination only works when every layer is in place. Samuel learned this the hard way as a young man. His mother gave him a jar of preserved ham to store in his small cottage while he was helping build a barn for a cousin. He hung dried herbs, he used cloth, but he stored it on a shelf near a south-facing window where summer heat built up during the day. The jar got warm. The herb smoke could not move through the cloth effectively because the heat created pressure inside the jar. Within 2 weeks, he had the same problem. He brought the jar back to his mother with maggots in it, and she did not scold him. She taught him. The jar temperature is the variable that changes everything. If the jar is warm, the cloth barrier is not enough. The herbs cannot work. The preservation fails. But in a true cold storage environment, with moving air and darkness, and cloth that physically blocks the landing site, flies do not establish a foothold. Not in 1 week. Not in 4 weeks. Not in 6 months. This is the forgotten survival skill that bridges two worlds. It is not a technique from a book. It is not something you learn in a homesteading class. It is something that generations of people who lived without electricity discovered through trial and failure and loss. And they passed it down not as theory, but as practice. The part that most people do not realize is that this three-layer system works backwards from how we are taught to think about pest control. Modern pest management focuses on attack, kill the pest, poison it, trap it, force it away with chemicals. The old knowledge focuses on prevention through environment. Make the conditions impossible for the pest to succeed. Do not poison the fly. Make your storage space somewhere a fly cannot lay eggs, cannot feed, cannot reproduce. The difference is not just philosophical. It is practical. When you kill a fly, 7 days later, another fly finds your storage space. When you make your storage space genuinely fly-proof, you have solved the problem for the entire season. No traps to empty, no poison to replace, no daily vigilance, just the arrangement of cold, herbs, cloth, and darkness working together in a way that your great-grandparents took for granted and most of us have forgotten completely. Now let me show you what this system looks like when it is actually working. A real root cellar from a working homestead in Ohio, where they have been using these exact methods for 63 years without a single spoilage season. The air temperature in this space never rises above 52 degrees, even in July. The humidity stays between 85 and 95%. There is no electricity running to this room, no refrigeration unit humming in the background, just the earth doing what the earth does when you build a structure that works with it instead of against it. The woman who manages this cellar is 81 years old. Her mother taught her this system. Her grandmother taught her mother. She has never lost a single jar of food to insect damage because the insects never arrive. The flies do not find the space. The beetles pass it by. The moths never discover what is inside. When you ask her why this works, she does not talk about chemistry or entomology. She talks about patience. She talks about arrangement. She talks about respecting what the plants and herbs are actually doing instead of trying to force them to do something they were never designed to do. The difference between this cellar and a modern pantry is not subtle. A modern pantry is a room. This is a conversation between the structure, the temperature, the humidity, the air movement, the herbs, and the cloth. Every element has a job. The cold slows the metabolism of every living thing inside. The herbs create an environment the fly recognizes as hostile. The cloth prevents direct contact between the food and the air that might carry spores or eggs. The darkness removes the navigation cue that flying insects use to locate food sources. Before matches were invented in 1826, people carried fire starters made from flint and steel everywhere they went. Long before that, they carried dried herbs everywhere they stored food. The herb did the work of protection. The herb was the technology, not as a fragrance, not as decoration, as an actual biological barrier against insect colonization. The surface of a sage leaf is not smooth. Under magnification, it is covered in tiny hair-like structures called trichomes. These structures contain oils that are toxic to many insects. When a fly lands on that leaf, it does not land. It detects the oil, recognizes the plant as a threat, and moves away. The fly has an olfactory system so sensitive it can detect the presence of food from 60 feet away through still air. It can also detect, with equal sensitivity, the presence of a plant that will poison it. This is not mythology. This is insect biology. The old farmers knew this without understanding the mechanism. They observed it. They saw that when they dried sage and hung it near stored food, the losses decreased. They saw that when they added bay leaves to grain storage, the weevils stopped appearing. They saw that when they wrapped cloth soaked in dried lavender around cheese, the flies found somewhere else to lay their eggs. They did not need to know why. They needed to know that it worked. And it did work. It still works. Here is something you almost never hear about in the modern pest control conversation. The reason this knowledge disappeared is not because it stopped working. It disappeared because in the 1950s, chemical pesticides became cheap and abundant, and they promised a faster solution. Spray once and the flies die in an hour. That was a genuinely appealing promise compared to drying herbs and waiting for the season to pass. But spray once and next week the flies return because you have not changed the environment. The flies have not learned the space is hostile. They have learned the space is dead. And dead spaces attract a different kind of insect altogether. The insects that feed on decay, on decomposition, on the residue left behind by poison. The shift from prevention to attack happened in one generation. Your great-grandparents knew how to prevent the fly. Your grandparents learned to attack the fly with chemicals. Your parents inherited that knowledge without question. And you grew up in a world where the chemical solution was so normal that the old prevention method became invisible. Not obsolete, invisible. Lost not because it failed, but because something faster and flashier replaced it. But here is what the chemical solution does not tell you. Every spray kills the flies you see and misses the hundreds you do not see. Those hundreds move to a different room, a different corner, a different storage space. They breed faster in response to the dead population because there is less competition for food. They lay eggs in places you did not think to protect because you were focused on one room. After 4 weeks, the problem is worse than it was before you sprayed. A fly generation is 7 days. In 28 days, a single pair of flies becomes 10,000 flies if they have access to food and the right temperature. Poison kills some of them. It does not stop the mathematics. The old method stops the mathematics by removing the variable that makes reproduction possible, the food source. If the fly cannot eat in your storage space, the fly cannot reproduce in your storage space. If the fly cannot reproduce, the population ends not in 4 weeks, but in the time span of a single generation. The cloth covering is part of this mathematics too. It is not there for aesthetics. It serves 3 functions that work together to make the space genuinely inhospitable to the fly. First, it blocks the visual cues that insects use to locate food. A fly can see movement and shape and color from a distance. It cannot see through cloth. Second, it creates a physical barrier between the food and the air, which means any eggs or spores that drift through the cellar cannot land on the food itself. Third, it holds the herb scent concentrated close to the food. The herbs dry and release their oils gradually. The cloth traps those oils near the storage container rather than dispersing them throughout the room. The cloth that works best is unbleached linen or cotton. Bleached cloth works too, but less effectively because bleaching removes some of the natural fibers that help trap the herb oils. Some farmers used fine mesh cloth. Some used layers of burlap. The specific material matters less than the principle. Something porous enough to allow air circulation, but dense enough to block the insect's visual navigation and trap the herb scent. In the old knowledge, the cloth you chose depended on what you had available. If you had linen, you used linen. If you had cotton, you used cotton. If you had burlap from grain sacks, you washed the burlap and used that. The principle stayed the same. The material was flexible. This is where the old knowledge differs most sharply from modern pest control instructions. Modern instructions are specific. Use this brand. Use this concentration. Follow these steps in this exact order. The old knowledge was adaptive. It worked with what was available. The principle was rigid. The execution was flexible. You needed cold, herbs, cloth, and darkness. How you achieved cold, which herbs you used, what kind of cloth you had, how you created darkness, those variables depended on your resources and your geography. A farmer in Vermont used different herbs than a farmer in Georgia because the flies that thrived in Vermont were different from the flies that thrived in Georgia. The cold that arrived naturally in Vermont in October came much later in Georgia. The prevention system had to adapt to the local climate and the local insect population. But the core principle did not change. Make the space cold. Make it smell hostile to insects. Cover the food. Remove the light. The flies will find somewhere else to live. I want to be very clear about something before we move forward. This system is prevention. It is not a cure. If you have flies already in your storage space, this system will stop new generations from breeding. It will not eliminate the current population instantly. Modern poison offers that promise. Kill them all in an hour. The old method offers something different. Stop the problem from recurring by making the space genuinely hostile to the life cycle of the insect. That is a different kind of solution. It requires patience. It requires understanding that you are not fighting the flies. You are restructuring the environment so the flies lose interest in living there. The smoking meat has been used for preservation for over 7,000 years. That smoke serves the same function as the dried herbs. It is a chemical barrier. It makes the surface of the meat hostile to insects and bacteria. When flies encounter smoke, they do not see a food source. They see an environment that will damage their respiratory system. They move away. The average modern person can only identify 3 to 5 wild edible plants. Our ancestors knew over 200. That knowledge gap exists largely because we outsourced food preservation to electricity and poison rather than learning to work with the natural systems that have been protecting food for millennia. The flies that attack food in autumn are different from the flies that attack food in summer. The beetles that target grain in spring are different from the beetles that target grain in winter. The old farmers understood these seasonal patterns because they lived inside them. They did not have climate control. They had to adapt their preservation methods to the insect populations that arrived with each season. That forced them to pay attention. That forced them to understand the enemy. And that understanding created a system that was genuinely resilient because it was built on observation, not theory. This is the knowledge I want to emphasize. Not the specific herbs, not the specific cloth, not the specific temperature. The foundational principle that you can prevent pest problems by structuring your environment rather than attacking the pest after it arrives. That principle is older than agriculture itself. The old root cellars, those underground chambers built beneath farmhouses across the Midwest and into Appalachia, they worked on this exact principle. Temperature naturally stayed between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, without any electricity, without any ice, without any modern intervention. The insects that thrive above ground simply could not survive at those temperatures. The fungi that spoil food could not propagate at those depths. The root cellar was not a storage building. It was an environment engineered to be hostile to the very things that destroy food, and it required nothing but gravity, earth, and the architecture of a hole dug into the ground. A single root cellar could preserve enough food for a family of 6 through an entire winter. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, apples, parsnips, all lasting from October through April without refrigeration, without any chemical additives, without any pest damage, because the environment itself prevented it. A modern family with a 200 square foot root cellar can store the equivalent of what a grocery store sells in 3 months. Think about that. 3 months of food security coming from a hole in the ground and an understanding of temperature dynamics. The problem is that modern Americans do not have root cellars. Most houses built in the last 40 years have concrete slabs instead of basements. The ones that do have basements are heated in winter, cooled in summer, kept at 70 degrees year-round. That is the opposite of what you need for long-term food storage. So the insects return, the mold returns, the rot returns. Because we rebuilt our homes to be convenient instead of resilient, and then we bought convenience foods to compensate for the storage space we destroyed. This is where the dried herbs come back into the picture. They are not just about killing the insects that are already there. They are about creating an environment where insects do not want to settle in the first place. An herb-dried storage system is a declaration of resistance against the modern grocery store model. It says, I will not depend on chemical sprays. I will not depend on refrigeration. I will use the methods that kept my ancestors alive. The Amish farmers I know, the ones I work alongside during harvest, they still use dried herbs in their food storage because it is not sentimental for them. It works. It has always worked. Their families do not get food poisoning from stored grains. Their preserved meats do not spoil. Their vegetables do not rot in storage because they built a system around the reality of how insects and mold actually behave, not around how convenient it is to go to the supermarket twice a week. The learning curve is steep. I will not pretend it is simple. You have to understand which herbs work for which foods. You have to know the difference between a cloth wrap that breathes and a seal that traps moisture. You have to observe your storage space the way the old farmers observed their cellars, paying attention to temperature changes, humidity shifts, the first signs of pest activity. You have to develop what I would call storage literacy, the ability to read what your food is telling you about the conditions it is living in. But here is the truth, that the modern system does not want you to know. This literacy is learnable. Your great-grandmother did not inherit this knowledge magically. She learned it by doing it. She failed sometimes. She had batches of grain that attracted beetles. She had preserved vegetables that went soft. She learned from those failures and adjusted. And after 10 years of that work, she could preserve food in ways that would last her family through seasons of scarcity without any loss. The herbs themselves are not magic. Dried sage, dried mint, dried lavender, dried rosemary. They are simply volatile oils and compounds that insects do not like. When you use them correctly, you are not poisoning the insects. You are making your storage space an unattractive place for them to breed. An environment where they will move on to easier targets. An environment where the natural chemistry of plants becomes your first line of defense, not your last resort after the infestation is already there. The flies that are alive right now in your kitchen, they arrived because your food storage attracted them, not because flies are inevitable, not because infestation is something you have to accept. They arrived because the conditions in your space were right for them, and the moment you change those conditions, they disappear. The moment you add the dried herbs, the moment you shift to cloth storage, the moment you lower the humidity in your grain bins, the insects lose interest. This is the skill the old farmers possessed. Not a single magic technique, a complete understanding of how pests think, what attracts them, what repels them, how to structure an environment so that prevention becomes automatic instead of constant warfare. And that understanding is still available to you. It is sitting right there in your kitchen garden if you grow herbs. It is sitting in every farmer's market if you do not. It is waiting in the simple act of observation and adjustment. The question for you is not whether this works. It works. The science is solid. The historical record proves it. The Amish farmers prove it every single day. The question is whether you are willing to learn it. Whether you are willing to spend a week this fall gathering herbs, tying them, hanging them, learning where to place them in your food storage. Whether you are willing to step outside the convenience model just enough to reclaim a skill that your ancestors would have considered essential. Because this is what survival actually looks like. Not camping trips or wilderness adventures. Not prepping for some imagined collapse. Real survival is knowing how to feed your family through the seasons, using only what you can grow, preserve, and store. Real survival is understanding that every insect that lands on your food is a messenger telling you that something in your storage environment is wrong. Real survival is being resilient enough that you do not have to call an exterminator because you have already prevented the problem. The herbs are just the beginning. They are your entry point into a way of thinking about food that predates grocery stores, predates chemistry, predates convenience. They are the bridge between the knowledge your great-grandparents carried and the resilience you can build starting today. dried sage in your grain, dried mint in your vegetable stores, dried lavender between your preserved meats. Small actions that compound into a storage system that actually works. That is what the old farmers knew. That is what I have tried to show you today. Now it is your turn to decide whether you want to learn it or whether you want to keep fighting with the modern system that promises convenience but delivers uncertainty every time you walk into your kitchen and flip the light switch on. Thank you for watching. If this skill resonated with you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new upload about the forgotten techniques that kept your ancestors alive. Hit the like button if this changed the way you think about food storage, and activate the notification bell so every time I release a new video about lost survival skills, you will be the first to know. I will see you in the next one. End of part 3. Script complete.